Welcome to our session, Breaking the Monolith, Unlearning Asian Pacific American Stereotypes. Andrea and I are super excited to welcome you all.
Today, we're going to talk about the historical roots of some stereotypes affecting Asian Pacific Americans in the United States, how different Asian Pacific American communities are affected by stereotypes, and what we can do to address stereotyping in your communities.
With the onset of COVID-19, Asian communities across the world has experienced an uptick in violence, with one national report finding over 11,000 anti-Asian incidents reported since March 2020. Unfortunately, we also know that a lot of this violence isn't new. It's rooted in a long history of stereotypes that have subjugated, exotified, and perpetually otherized Asian people. And so our title, Breaking the Monolith, is an intentional rejection against these stereotypes that have long treated Asian people as a monolithically powerless and invisible group.
So go to the next slide. We'll introduce ourselves. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors, and I serve as the Manager of Education Initiatives at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, or APAC, where we share APA history, art, and culture through innovative museum experiences.
And my name is Takeru TK Nagayoshi. I am the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, the Professional Learning Director of Community Events at Panorama Education, and one of the featured educators in the We Are Not a Stereotype project, which is a Smithsonian APAC webinar series where Andrea and I first met and collaborated, and we're going to be talking about later on.
Our session today aims to showcase why pedagogies of representation are important for school communities, especially as Asian and Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the US today and expected to grow from 5 million to 35 million people by the year 2060.
So Andrea and I, we're going to be exploring some common Asian tropes and stereotypes, including their historical origins. And we're going to be guiding you, the audience, through what we call an object deep dive activity, where you can also follow along as well.
We're also going to share where you can access free resources about unlearning these stereotypes and share more about the We Are Not a Stereotype project that TK mentioned. So please stay tuned until the end.
All right, so let's get right into this. The next slide, please. So to best unpack many of the emblematic Asian stereotypes throughout the decades, we're going to do an object deep dive activity where Andrea and I present 3 sets of images or artifacts that reflect harmful Asian stereotypes.
So as TK and I look at these objects, we're going to be using Harvard Project Zero thinking routine See, Think, Wonder, which is a great pedagogical routine that helps students critically examine a text through different lenses: what we objectively see, what we subjectively think about what we see, and what all of this makes us wonder.
It's a really great activity. You can use it in any classroom, especially for a lot of the sensitive topics that might stir up, emotions. It's a great learning exercise that also helps students ground their thoughts and their emotional reactions to actual evidence. And so while Andrea and I practice this routine, again, we encourage you all to reflect along with what you see, what you think, and you wonder as well.
Lastly, before we get started, some of these objects can be difficult to look at, so we encourage you to take care and step away if needed. So with all that being said and done, let's look at our first object. If we go to the next slide, please. All right, TK. Let's look at this image together, letting our eyes wander from corner to corner, from side to side, and then letting our eyes settle into the middle of this image. And for our audience members, feel free to follow along with us in this close looking exercise. So I'm taking this all in. TK, can you tell me what you see?
All right, so I see a man on the left assaulting another man on the right, who appears to be stereotypically Asian, with the robe and the long ponytail. I'm also seeing at the top, right, a text, and he went for that heathen Chine or Chinese, right? And then the assaulter is holding a table, and there are also what seems to be like playing cards scattered about.
Those are good observations. Thank you, TK. All right, now can you tell me what you think is happening in this image?
I think the men were playing cards, and maybe the man on the left got angry because he lost. The word heathen definitely sticks out to me. It means someone who's uncivilized, someone who's not religious. And so that makes me think that maybe the author, the illustrator of this believes that, I don't know, maybe the Chinese men deserved to get assaulted, maybe because they don't share the same faith.
Interesting. All right, finally, what does this image make you wonder?
I wonder, what the relationship between these two men are, right? Is it a manager and worker situation where they're just like strangers at a bar? that they just met. I also wonder why the Chinese man is depicted so comically, right? It's almost like a cartoon when he's actually getting assaulted. And that also makes me wonder, like, what the intended effect of this image is for the viewer. Like, am I supposed to laugh at the Chinese man? Am I supposed to sympathize with him? Or are we supposed to be taking the perspective of the assaulter?
This is so interesting. Thank you, TK, for sharing. So TK made some important observations and shared some interesting insights on what might be happening in this image. So I'm going to share some context about what it is we're looking at. The image in this card is an illustration of a poem by Bret Harte called Plain Language from Truthful James, and it was made around 1870. This object is in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History's collections. It shows a white card shark cheating and assaulting a Chinese man who is depicted as wearing robes and a long queue, the long ponytail that TK pointed out, which is a very typical hairstyle that Chinese men wore during this time. The image was supposed to criticize the growing prejudice and violence against Chinese laborers who migrated to the United States to work on railroads, mines, and other very hard labor jobs. Many white laborers saw Chinese workers as competition for jobs, a sentiment still held against many immigrant communities today. The sentiment was so powerful at the time, especially along the US West Coast, that California eventually prohibited Chinese immigration with the passing of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first federal law to explicitly exclude immigration for a specific nationality. The text on the image says, and he went for that heathen Chinese, or Chine as TK had pointed out. It's a line from a poem by Bret Harte and often misinterpreted as a condemnation of Chinese laborers. But Harte, who was opposed to anti-Chinese sentiments, actually wrote the poem as satire to challenge racism. The poem and this illustration, however, was instead seen as condoning racism and supporting anti-Chinese sentiments.
Which is like pretty ironic, right? That there's this caricature that's being used to condemn racism, but it ended up reinforcing it. And I think it underscores how a lot of the time stereotypical images and tropes, they take a life of their own. And that's especially true for groups that have so few positive media and cultural representations to begin with. And I also think, like, regardless of what the author's intentions were, I think the fact that this Chinese man is depicted in such like a foreign, alien way, right? His cartoonish expression, the exotic garb that he's wearing, the term heathen even, right? It's almost as though the audience is being primed not to relate with the Chinese guy and might end up empathizing with the assaulter instead, which seems like is what happened.
Right, and there's actually much more to the story. So according to Bret Harte's poem, which this illustration is based off of, the Chinese immigrant, Sin, outsmarts his white opponent who is cheating in a card game. At first, the cheater treats Sin like a child and assumes that he wouldn't understand the game at all. But eventually, the cheater gets so frustrated that Sin plays better than him, and then he accuses him of cheating and then attacks him, as we see right here.
Yeah, the cheater treating Sin like a child. Very reminiscent, right, of the patronizing and infantilizing portrayals and attitude that Westerners, especially at the time, had of people of color. And I think, like, a lot of those older stereotypes have this echo of infantilization that reveals the inherent power dynamic and racial hierarchy that positions people of color as inferior. And so, like, again, in that context, right, even the assault, again, regardless of what Harte or the author's intention was, ends up being codified, read as justified. For me, at least, like the composition, right? The image reminds me of like a circus leader taming an unruly animal for entertainment.
Absolutely, and that's what stereotypes often do, right? They flatten groups, remove them of their humanity, and in doing so, it distorts our view to justify the prejudice and violence against these groups. If we're conditioned to see a group as inferior or worthy of blame, it's easier to justify violence against them, something that we're seeing right now with this current rise of anti-Asian violence. So this is great. We're going to move on to our next set of objects. We're going to continue with our See, Think, Wonder. So the next slide, we're going to see 3 examples of stereotypes during the 1920s and 1930s in Hollywood. We're moving forward in time. These 3 images are movie posters featuring the first Chinese American movie star, Anna May Wong. So TK, similar to what we did before, please let your eyes wander across the screen, side by side, corner to corner. And as your eyes center into the middle of these 3 images here, can you tell me what you see, think, and wonder about these posters? We'll start with the first one. Can you tell me what you see?
All right. So I see Anna May depicted as like an imposing figure. Like a lot of them feature her with a big head, and she has this intense, almost intimidating stare and a gaze toward what it seems like two white male-female leads, at least in the middle and the right image. I also see words like Shanghai, dragon, Chungking, and a picture of a dragon on the right poster. And then on that same poster, I see that stupid, fake Asian font, you know, the ones that you see in like takeout that really annoys me.
The chopstick font, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, TK. What do you think is happening in these images?
I think the producers, they really wanted to lay it on thick that Anna May Wong was Asian. And so basically they're like accentuating everything stereotypically Asian, from her appearance, the dragon symbolism. And they're trying to do this all to convey how this film is super exotic and it's like an Oriental film. I also think that Anna May is a villain, right? Or supposed to be in the villain. I haven't seen the films. Especially in the middle one, she has this sinister, almost menacing expression with dark shadows. So,
absolutely. There's a lot of use of green in some of these posters, and red and yellow. Thank you. And so finally, what do these images make you wonder?
I wonder how these films, you know, were they received by the Asian communities in a good way, right? At the time, was it groundbreaking that there was an Asian woman leading Hollywood, or were there grumblings and frustrations about the portrayal? And I also wonder, like, the actress herself, Anna May Wong, how did she feel about her depictions?
It's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your observations and responses, TK. So these posters explore some of the stereotypes and biases that the mainstream media have popularized about Asian American and also Pacific Islander women to some degree. These posters exemplify the Hollywood practice of yellow face, when the media portrays a more American-centric, often highly stereotypical and unrealistic portrayal of Asian people. So with accents, with facial features. In these examples in particular, Wong's Asian features and heritage are exotified for a mainly white audience. Wong herself was made to speak and act in a highly stylized, stereotypically Asian manner. For women, especially at this time, this meant a hypersexualized depiction. Wong is a perfect example of the duality of how Asian women are stereotyped, either as being submissive and docile or as a dragon lady, a strong, deceitful, domineering, and sexually alluring woman. We can see some of that dragon lady stereotype in these three posters, such as the sinister look of her face, hovering over other characters who look terrified of her.
And I think, right, like that stereotype that you've mentioned, it works on two levels. On one hand, it definitely underscores this idea that there's something perpetually foreign and mysterious about the Far East, and by extension, Asian people. And that's a trope that persists even today. Like, I'm still asked every once in a while, where are you really from? As though being American and being Asian is something that can't be reconciled. And then on the other hand, right, the stereotype, it also plays to the objectification, that exotification of that perpetual other, which we know for women is much more harmful and has dangerous consequences.
That's absolutely right. And in thinking about just our recent times, between March 2020 and March 2021, APA women were twice as likely to report experiencing incidents of discrimination, with 78% of women reported being affected by anti-Asian racism. And in April 2021, we saw the tragedy of 8 people losing their lives in Atlanta, Georgia, with 6 of the victims being Asian women. Many advocates believe that the stereotype that Asian women are submissive and hypersexual played a role in the perpetrator's motive.
I remember a lot of those conversations.
They were really hard conversations.
Yeah. Okay, so my turn in the next slide, please. All right, so Andrea, you're gonna see images that reflect an idea that the scholars call the model minority myth. And the model minority stereotype basically gained currency in the 1960s, had a bit of a resurgence in the 1980s, and is one of those things whose legacy still impacts much of how we continue to see Asian people to this day. So, Andrea, your turn to react. And then audience members, I know we can't see your chat or, but hopefully you are also following along and reflecting alongside with us as well. But let us wander across or have our eyes wander across the screen, look from left to right, all through the corners. And then the first question, Andrea, to you. Can you tell me what you see.
Okay. So I'm starting with the image on the left, what looks like the newspaper article clipping. I see an illustration of young children playing behind a fence. I also see people standing in line. Some people look like they're working. And then with the image on the right, the Time magazine cover, I see a lot of young people of seemingly East Asian descent posing in front of a chalkboard with those large computers we used to use, books, and also school supplies, like holding onto a backpack.
Yeah. And then I think the text there also reads like those Asian American whiz kids, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right. So tell me what you think is happening in these images.
When I look at these together, I think people of mostly East Asian descent is who we see, are being shown as being hard workers, diligent, and successful. With the students on the Time magazine cover, it appears to be showing that students of East Asian descent are good students, they're happy, and they're successful in their academic careers.
Mm. And putting it all together, what do these images make you wonder?
A lot of things. But with these images, I wonder how these stories not only perpetuated stereotypes, but also left readers with a sense of these stereotypes being unquestionable. So for example, I've met some educators who have shared that their Asian students are model students because their culture values education, which is very harmful because it insinuates that other cultures do not value education.
Mm. Yeah, no, I love those observations, right? And so first of all, I do appreciate you naming that East Asians, right, as that sort of part of the model minority stereotype being depicted, because when it comes to the model minority stereotype, by and large, to a large degree, it's oftentimes projected onto East and sometimes South Asians. Secondly, going back to your educator anecdote, I think that's a great example of how stereotypes that on one hand might seem positive on the surface can still have a lot of those negative implications. All right, so let me give you a little bit more context here. We'll start from the newspaper on the left. So that is from a New York Times Magazine article in the 1960s. And a sociologist by the name of William Peterson first coined the term model minority in it, right? And in that article, he basically cherry picks observations from an internment camp of Japanese Americans. And he concludes that there are inherent cultural traits that predisposes Japanese and Asian Americans as uniquely suited to succeed more than other racial and ethnic groups. And then moving over to the Times article on the right, well, that was published in 1987. And even at the time, it did face some backlash among Asian communities for perpetuating the hurtful stereotype. And you know, I've grown up with that stereotype too. It's this idea that Asian people are one-dimensional nerds. We're great at math and studying, but perhaps not much else. And like I mentioned, it's that stereotype that I had to personally deal with the most growing up. I'd be rich if I got a nickel for every time someone was like, "You're so smart because you're Asian," right? And to your point, right, both of these examples are of the model minority stereotype. And again, that stereotype is this idea that Asian people are smarter, they're more hardworking, they achieve higher levels of socioeconomic success than other racial minority groups. And like most stereotypes, they are incorrect and also harmful. And we'll try to do our best to explain why. So we know that the model minority myth, or the model minority stereotype, is a myth. And it is a myth that is based off of outdated, inaccurate, and generalized stereotypes that treat all Asian people to be the same. And a lot of its proponents of this myth, right, like perhaps the folks who wrote these two pieces, they tend to cherry pick selective evidence. They lean into scientific racism, right, pseudoscience, and they also omit a lot of inconvenient causal explanations that would better explain why there are differences among some racial and ethnic groups. And so in some, it's based on that science.
Absolutely. It's also bad data science as well. The stereotype that all Asians are smart basically lumps the most diverse racial group as a bland monolith. We know the APA umbrella is incredibly rich and diverse with Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, East Asians, Southeast Asians, Central Asians, and West Asians. The list goes on. But a stereotype like this flattens the vast disparities in history, language, and culture that exist across our communities. So when we see and treat all Asian people as the same, we not only erase their diversity, but also their humanity.
Yep. And even like that Times Magazine image, right? We only see East Asians, to your point. And to my earlier point, I think it's a great example of how those seemingly positive stereotypes can also have negative implications. And so circling back even to that educator anecdote, like I've heard it too, right? Teachers essentially implying or saying that their Asian students are so smart and so well behaved. And I always think when I hear those kind of comments, right? If educators subconsciously believe that Asian kids are inherently smarter or that their culture values education more than other cultures, I honestly wonder, right, what might they also subconsciously be thinking about other racial groups? And how does that thinking impact how they teach and how they treat those other groups?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And, for the record, those assumptions impact Asian students too. When Asian students are assumed to be smart and only seen as high academic performers in school, issues that may be negatively affecting them, their families and communities, and their mental health is overlooked. So, for example, according to a finding by the nonprofit organization Act to Change, 8 out of 10 Asian Americans experience bullying in person and online. In 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, 70% of Asian Americans experienced or witnessed an increase in cyberbullying generally. And in school environments, 40% of victims are experiencing bullying in school and online. So these numbers are alarming, and they've only been rising since 2020. And we know this thanks to amazing groups like Stop AAPI Hate, Act to Change, and so many others.
Thank you for that. And also thank you for highlighting some of the implications of bullying, right? When this stereotype exists that AAPI people, Asian people are nerds and geeks, right? Awesome. So that is all for Object Deep Dive activity. And while we couldn't see your responses, we do hope that you enjoyed reading along. Actually, no, you weren't reading each other's comments. You were just thinking them as you were hearing our reflections. And you also might be wondering how you can learn more about these issues or how you might be able to implement some of these and other pedagogical ideas in your classrooms for the educators who are listening. And we got you covered in the next slide.
So as TK mentioned earlier in the session, this We Are Not a Stereotype series is an educator-led webinar series on Asian Pacific American stereotypes. Brought to you by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, it's a video series for educators by educators, and one that breaks down topics spanning multiple timelines, geographies, and identities.
I had the wonderful privilege of working with Andrea, but also on several entries as well. One examined the intersection of Asian and queer or LGBTQ plus identities. And as an Asian kid in the United States, I've had very few opportunities to see myself reflected in my own education, in my curricula. And so getting to combine my identity as a teacher and an Asian American through this project felt incredibly liberating.
TK is awesome in the series. The series features a dozen episodes featuring Asian educators like TK from across the country. And as a coordinator for the project, I wanted to center their voices, their expertise, and pedagogy, especially at a time of increased anti-Asian sentiment. The key question we asked each creator in developing every video was, what do you want to teach that you were never taught in school?
Yeah, and that was a question that sparked so much inspiration, but we'd rather show than tell. So let's take a look at 2 examples in the next slide. And we wanted to share excerpts from 2 of these webinars. So one, as you can see, is the model minority and the bamboo ceiling, both of which features yours truly.
So in this first clip, the model minority myth, educators Liz Kleiderock, Dr. Kiona, and TK unpack the origins and implications of the model minority stereotype, delving deeper into the topic that TK and I discussed earlier today. And in this excerpt, TK argues how Asian stereotypes are often weaponized against BIPOC community. So let's go ahead and take a look.
My section is going to examine the consequences of buying into this myth, and be they the ways in which it perpetuates anti-Blackness or that it gives Asian people the illusion of social progress for a reality. And so I'm going to go back to the New York Times article published by William Peterson in the 1960s. And as Dr. Kiana mentioned, the article widely popularized the concept of the model minority myth, right? First by ascribing Japanese success story to very oversimplified cultural values, very broad generalizations, things like values in education and hard work, the fact that they revere family and community, that they respect authority and law. What I wanted to highlight here is how a lot of these cultural stereotypes of light-skinned East Asian people are not just long enduring, right? They still sustain today, but they also contrast neatly with stereotypes that are levied against other racial groups, particularly Black and brown folks. And in Peterson's article, he goes as far as calling them problem minorities. And so I'm going to show you guys a slide where we kind of juxtapose the common stereotypes that are ascribed to both Asian and Black people in the United States. As you see these different stereotypes emerge, I want us to notice how they perfectly serve as direct contrasts to one another. Whereas Asian people are stereotyped, for instance, as educated and hardworking, Black people in America and dark-skinned people of color by large are oftentimes stereotyped as being uneducated and unmotivated. Whereas Asian communities are stereotyped as law-abiding. Black communities have been criminalized, surveilled, and harassed by law enforcement for centuries. And so that's really the problem, right? When we think about the model minority myth, especially as they relate to other racial groups. The trope not only implies that racial discrimination is something that can be overcome, so as long as if you have gumption, right? If Asians can do it, why can't Blacks? But it also ends up ignoring a lot of the systemic, institutional, the ideological power structures that create and maintain a lot of these inequities among racial groups in the first place. And so at best, what this myth does is that it suggests racial and ethnic groups that experiencing this hardship, right, are lacking in some kind of genetic cultural traits that are requisite for success. And at worst, it ends up serving as a racial wedge politics that divides solidarity among people of color and perpetuate anti-Blackness.
It's so strange to like see and hear my voice as I'm doing. But for that particular topic, and as you can see from that example, right, it was really important that we were highlighting how those stereotypes impact all groups. Oftentimes, I think it's like easy to just focus on how one racial group is impacted by a stereotype. But in this work, right, it's super key to important to recognize, right, that our struggle, there's a commonality to it, and to also highlight that our oppression, our liberation, it's all bound up together.
Right, and it was really important for us to include this topic in this series because, as TK just said, it's not just one racial group being impacted by the stereotype. We needed to talk about the historic roots of the model minority myth, the social context in which it was created, and its intentions to wedge different racial groups against each other, specifically Asian and Black communities. The model minority myth has the allure of being a positive stereotype, as TK has mentioned before, that there are many pitfalls and harms associated with it that we wanted to address with a broader audience.
Thanks for that. All right, so let's look at the second clip. So this is called the bamboo ceiling, and Suprita Pitsme and I examine how Asian people are impacted in the workplace. And so we investigate the concept of the bamboo ceiling, and basically that's this phenomenon where Asian people are oftentimes excluded or underrepresented in professional spaces, particularly in managerial and leadership positions. And so in this excerpt, Suprita and I are exploring common obstacles that an Asian person might encounter, especially as they're building their career. So let's take a look.
Chapter 3, Building Her Career, Questioning Cultural Norms and Values. At her new job, Educate Squared, Jenny feels like she's thriving in her role. In her first 90 days, she gets glowing reviews on her organizational systems and so-called amenable demeanor. Despite the strong first-year review, though, and her solid output, Jenny isn't promoted, much to her dismay. Midway through her second year on staff, her colleagues and manager begin giving her feedback that she's too quiet and not contributing as much during her larger team meetings. Her manager even comments that Jenny's problem is that she fails to put herself out there. Now, this kind of feedback frustrates Jenny because she values approaching her teammates via listening first, creating space for others, and prioritizing collective goals over individual ones.
Jenny also experiences microaggressions from her colleagues. She's often mistaken for the only other Asian woman on staff. She gets asked where she's really from and is too frequently delegated to tasks that require spreadsheets and projections because, according to one senior manager, she's really good at math. This disappoints Jenny because she'd like to be involved in more creative decisions, but her colleagues see her better suited for roles dealing with operations, data analysis, and computational work. Rather than making a big stink of these microaggressions, Jenny bottles up her frustrations. She begins to feel like she's putting on a mask at work, and this sometimes affects her performance and her well-being. As the years go on, Jenny increasingly feels the disconnect between her personal values and the cultural values of her workplace, a predominantly white institution, or PWI. She notices that the leaders around her, who are mostly white men, take up a lot of space, make decisions on their own, and are praised for their individual accomplishments rather than their contributions to the team. This leader archetype is so at odds with how Jenny operates that she wonders if she'll ever be promoted to a senior level position. In fact, in her darker moments, she secretly wonders if Asian people like her are even fit for leadership to begin with. She was once teased by a colleague that Asian people don't have the personality or charisma to lead a team. Jenny thinks maybe this is true. After all, she's never even seen an Asian leader in her profession.
I'm really excited and also really proud that we included this topic in the series. It covers so many challenging experiences in the workplace. As Sukrita and TK mentioned, some of these challenges are lack of representation in leadership and management. It's discrimination based on one's name, assumptions of where you're really from, also racial imposter syndrome, and even the experience of being the interchangeable Asian when you're confused with another Asian person in the workplace. So TK, since we've been able to see you in this video and the previous one, what was it like working on this particular video for the series?
This was like my favorite one to work on. Not to throw shade on the other ones, they were really good as well. Sukrita is amazing, but I really loved researching for and working on all of the different aspects of a person's career. And so basically what we've done here, and you saw that, right, is we've did what's called a persona activity. And we made up this hypothetical character named Jenny, and we told a story about her professional journey through the lens of being Asian. And so each chapter, and I think the one that we saw was chapter 3, it was divided by common career milestones from applying to the first job all the way to her retirement. And in between each of those chapters, Suk and I weave narrative, research, commentary to essentially highlight a lot of the challenges an Asian person might experience in a professional context. And lastly, it's also beautifully animated by our editor, Nathan. And so if folks are interested, definitely check it out.
Do a quick shout out for Nathan Kawanishi. Thank you. Thank you, TK. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that in addition to the model minority myth video and the bamboo ceiling video, there are many other topics that we cover. We also recognize that this is a series that has many more topics to cover. It's not encyclopedic yet, but there's always much more work to be done. And here on this slide, you can see all the topics that are currently covered in the We Are Not a Stereotype series.
Yeah, and I love that keyword yet, right? We see even just on this side, Asian Black solidarity movements, Islamophobia, the racialization of undocumented Asians, the erasure of Southeast Asians cased in the United States, just to name a few.
And we wanted to acknowledge that many of the examples that TK and I shared today, from Anime Wong to the model minority myth, were primarily based on East Asian stereotypes. The series, however, is intentional about capturing the diversity of APA experiences, as these topic titles show. After all, we don't want to perpetuate the monolith by teaching in a monolith. So as we get closer to ending our time together, on the next slide, I think there's one quote in particular that speaks to so much of this journey. So here's a quote that resonated with me as a coordinator for this project and the work I do at the Smithsonian. And in working with educators in this series, this really rings true. So TK, could you read this out loud for us, please?
Absolutely. Not everything is taught to us in school. It's up to us to find out.
Thank you. I love this quote. It means something different to me every time I see it. So this quote by the incredible Asian American activist Yuri Kochiyama really speaks to this challenge of education. It is up to us to find out. And Yuri Kochiyama has made a lifetime career out of educating us and teaching us about so much of the histories that we don't learn in school. Many of the educators in this series talk about how they had to find APA histories and histories of their own communities on their own, through books, articles, conversations with community members, even following fellow educators and scholars on social media. This is a long symptom of the erasure of APAs and textbooks and other resources about US history. And while there's been a long erasure, things are changing in the education space. To unlearn stereotypes and learn about APA community histories and stories, education is being seen more and more as a critical solution to fighting bias and building knowledge and empathy about APA humanity. In fact, 53% of Asian Americans and 58% of Pacific Islanders see education as a solution.
And just personally speaking from a person who worked on this project and having worked alongside a lot of incredible API Asian educators, I know that we, Andrea and the Smithsonian, see education as a solution as well, which is why it was important for us to come together with that aim to tell stories and histories that we didn't learn in school. So the entire series and the corresponding resources are available for all of you to access at any time at the Smithsonian. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. You can find all of our webinars and more on the Learning Lab at learninglab.si.edu/org/APAC.
So we created 5 Learning Lab collections for the series, designed with the educator in mind, to build knowledge, awareness, and confidence in teaching what may or may not be new content. Each Learning Lab has a series of thinking routines similar to the one we use today, access to primary source materials, explainer videos, links to community-created resources, and activities to support reflection and processing new information. We know that it can be very overwhelming at times to take in new content. All the Learning Labs are designed to be adaptable for different teaching and learning environments.
I definitely want to underscore that for educators by educators component. And oftentimes for underrepresented groups, right? Since our history, since our education, right, wasn't given to us in the systems that we occupy, it was really important to center our voices there. All right, so before we close out, why don't we circle back to our title, Breaking the Monolith? And I think it's in the next slide, please. Yeah. So as we've been mentioning throughout, there is so much to the APA experience. That should make it abundantly clear for those of us who are listening that we are not a stereotype, we are not a monolith.
Right, quite the contrary. APAs are incredibly diverse. There are over 50 different ethnic groups and over 100 languages in the APA umbrella. And APA communities have ties and connections to lands all around the world. Our diasporic presence and stories are even bigger and much more vast. The APA term is complex and also relatively new. In 1980, the US Census Bureau created the Asian and Pacific Islander category, and since then, there have been a number of variations of umbrella terms used to group our many communities together, like AAPI, Asian American and Pacific Islander, and AANHPI, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander.
Yeah, and you also probably heard me say API as well. That's the term that I am oftentimes used to. But those terms, right, these umbrella terms, they come with unique challenges, some of which we've touched on throughout this presentation. And I think it's important to remember that under the umbrella, there are countless lived experiences, countless stereotypes that affect people in different ways. And so we want to hold those different tensions together.
And in this presentation, TK and I wanted to break this monolith in several ways today, as you've seen. In recognizing the diversity and nuance within the APA community, that's one step. Critically examining stereotypes is another. And lastly, embracing the tensions that exist among different communities is an important step as well.
Yeah, but we'd also like to hear from you. And prior to this, we thought that there'd be some kind of chat interaction. Apparently there's not, but don't worry. Feel free to connect with us offline and let us know what other creative ways that there might be to break the monolith. So yeah, Andrea, what do you want to do? Do you want to just like talk about certain challenges that exist in doing this work, some opportunities that might exist?
I think we should talk about some of the challenges, because some of the feedback and questions I often receive from educators is how to do this work, but then also can we have a real conversation about how hard it is to do this work, to one, learn new histories and then unlearn a lot of things that we probably already knew and maybe unconsciously developed a bias about things, based on what we saw in the media. So, going back to a lot of those steps that you and I practiced today on critically examining stereotypes through objects and, imagery, and also talking about these tensions that do exist within these stereotypes. For you and your work, TK, what are some challenges that you've run into in doing this work of unlearning and also breaking the monolith?
Yeah, great question. And I also want to call back to the thinking routine that we did. It's something that I always did as an English teacher. And one of the things, especially when we're dealing with topics that might be sensitive, and have a lot of emotional reactions that it can stir among students is the importance of being able to separate what we're seeing, feeling, and reacting with what is actually being there. And so really intentional, even in the design of the object deep dive that we had, was ensuring that we were isolating both those processes. And by having, here's what we're seeing, here's what we're thinking, and here's what we're wondering, right? Just as a pedagogical tool, it allows us to essentially, right, especially for the students, ground a lot of their thinking in evidence, right, in the things that we're seeing. And so I think part of the challenge here first is like, well, what are the facts? What are the objective things that we can all point to and agree as part of our reality? And it's a skill that's especially needed in our social media age when there's so much falsehoods and so much misinformation abound. And so we definitely want to be intentional around that when doing this kind of work. What about you?
Absolutely.
Andrea?
That's a really good question. I think about this a lot because I think these challenges are things that we're faced with every day in the work that we do at the Asian Pacific American Center. And I think in the work that I do with educators and also with my amazing colleagues and educators at the Smithsonian is we can't lose sight of the fact that even just building awareness is still very much an important part of this work. There are folks who have never heard of the mono-minority myth or the bamboo ceiling. And so making, naming those things, talking about how they show up in our working lives, in our social lives, even in our cultural lives is very important. And then engaging in dialogue, talking about the intentions, the impacts that these stereotypes have on us as human beings, and how we can talk about ways in which we can stop certain behaviors and interrogate them a little bit, reflect on maybe what we've learned by the erasure of AAPIs in school, and think about how we might be able to forge something together to make sure that for future generations, this is not something that's happening, especially in school environments where more youth will experience bullying and hate. It's really challenging work. And I think, you know, we've mentioned the mono-minority myth several times, but there are so many additional stereotypes that we haven't mentioned that are affecting people right now in many different contexts. And we've talked about them in the series, but in having conversations with real people to talk about those real lived experiences and the harm, it's very important. And I know even in our We Are Not a Stereotype series, there's so much that we haven't covered. And so I think what you and I have kept talking about is making sure that we're mindful of different ways in which people are affected by just stereotypes in general is important, and also to learn not to, you know, like accidentally give in to them, you know. So it's good to stop, ask questions, reflect. Yeah, it's hard work, but please.
Can I? Yeah, no, I'm really resonating with what you said about like the real experiences, right? And I think one of the things that we haven't done yet is kind of share our own sort of experiences being an Asian person, right? Being an Asian American, and then getting a chance to engage in this. And as I was thinking about like additional opportunities and challenges, one for me as a gay Asian American, a Japanese American, a son of immigrants, was the importance of intersectionality. And oftentimes when we think through these identities, it's easy to isolate things just through a racial lens. But then when we think about the generational differences, the diasporic differences, the ethnic differences, the linguistic differences, there are so many things, right, that we can unpack. And the ways in which we can really get to that nuance is oftentimes reflecting on the intersectionalities and personal experiences that we have. And so, Andrea, my question to you with all of that said is, in doing this project, in overseeing it, what have you learned personally about your own identity as an Asian person?
Oh my gosh.
Putting you on the spot.
That's a great question. I mean, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. You know, something you mentioned with the Time Magazine article with the Asian American whiz kids. I remember when that came out, and I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, I don't know what to think about this. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? You know, because, you know, you had shared a reflection of being assumed to be like really good at math and quantitative sciences. I got that, but in a way where it was just like, oh, you must be good at that half of the time because I'm multiracial, I'm half Asian. And so a lot of that, the added layer is sort of the quantifying of our own identities, you know? And so for me as a a female multiracial woman, there are very different experiences. And I've had a lot of time to reflect on that even through our time together. I've reflected a lot, and I continue to be on this journey of reflecting on my own privilege of being half white, half East Asian, and thinking about what that means for me in the work that I do, in the connections that I make, in the relationships that I build, being really aware of that, and what my presence might mean into a space. And so that is a lifelong journey I will always be on. But it's been a really enlightening experience to think about the breadth of identity in being Asian. Yeah. When I was a kid in school, not seeing a lot of Asian American people in what I was learning, it was really hard to identify with the content. It was really hard to identify with this sense of belonging. Not so much inclusion, but do I belong here? And, it's been really exciting to see now as education is being propelled as more of a solution. I'm very excited to see maybe 20 years from now, hopefully even just like 1 year from now, changes in the curriculum so that younger people can see themselves in what they're learning. I have the great privilege of mentoring interns who come to the APA Center, and even interns who recently graduated even high school and college talk about how they don't see themselves in their curriculum. And so I think that is something we can work towards finding solutions for, so that for these young generations and the future generations, hopefully they don't have to have this question about belonging.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the themes in the queer and Asian webinar that Suk and I also did was, to your point of the importance of kind of self-reflection and also being in community, right? Given how that there's so many different intersectional identities, we really want to make sure that to unlock it, right, we're actually having these conversations and exploring the different nuances. Hopefully with things like social media and TikTok, like younger generations do have an opportunity to be able to share their story and add to that broader conversation of what it means to be Asian while still retaining that essence of who they are and like the very unique perspective that they have as a result of all of the different intersectional identities that they hold.
Absolutely. I'd say, TK, question for you, and thinking about your role as an educator. You've worked with students and in your work in the education space, given everything that we've been talking about, even in this great conversation, what do you think we can and should do moving forward to better this representation and sense of belonging?
Oh, can and should do. In addition to the things that we've done to break that monolith, I think solidarity and allyship is so important. And I think, in education, we talk about like everything kind of being siloed. And I think that's a concept that can also be applied to organizing work. It's easy to just kind of look at the ways in which your particular group is being impacted and advocate through that narrow lens. But it's all part of this broader system, right? I remember as a classroom teacher, I had an Asian student come in one day, and she was really pissed off about affirmative action. And she told me straight in my face, Mr. Nagayoshi, affirmative action is so unfair because Asian people are being shafted by Black and Latinx people. And in that moment, I had to kind of stop and A, sort of reflect like, oh, damn, those were thoughts that I had growing up as well. But B, think about, well, how can I address that concern that she has, but in a way that is more in solidarity with other groups? And so it actually opened up a really wonderful discussion and opportunity for us to examine, well, like, why do those politics exist, right, when it comes to college admissions? What are, right, sort of the reasons behind affirmative action in terms of representation? And also, right, quite frankly, this is true amongst AAPI communities, Asian communities, there is a lot of anti-Blackness as well. And so what does it mean for you to say, we're being shafted by these other racial groups? And I hope, right, that in doing that and having those conversations, as tough as they are, we sort of leave the space recognizing that we are stronger together and that a lot of our struggles that we have, the challenges that we have, are really bound together. And by interrogating those broader systems, right, those isms, we can hopefully get over them, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think what you were just sharing on having those difficult conversations, sometimes the most difficult ones can start in the family unit at home. But those conversations are so important to address a lot of the anti-Blackness that exists in our communities. And, you know, really addressing it when we hear it and talking about it and having that conversation. And I think the work of education is so important on this individual interpersonal level. And I think the more we can do that and encourage others to do the same, hopefully we will start working towards some change and better empathy and understanding.
100%, 1000%. Let's go to our final slide so that I can thank everyone here for joining our session. We hope you enjoyed breaking the monolith with us and also leave with a greater understanding about Asian stereotypes, some of their origins and their implications.
Thank you all so much for joining us again. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors.
And I am Takeru TK Nagayoshi. Please enjoy the rest of the summit. Stay cool, and please feel free to stay in touch.